Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, who right before we got on air was like, hey, there's only 25 weeks left of this book. We should probably hurry up and get to it. And I am joined by Greg, who probably hates me for reminding him that we have 10 more books after the 25 weeks of this book. How are you feeling early on in book 5? We've got a little bit of momentum, but we often talk about the early part of books being slow. How are you feeling with this one?
I'm feeling good. I'm excited to continue on. Tylor knows this, but I'll say it on air. My family and I have been doing this summer project where all these bookstores got together. It's called the North of Boston Bookstore Passport, and you just go visit the bookstore and you get a stamp. So I've spent a ton of time, and as it is designed, you go to these cool bookstores and you want to just buy something because you drove
Yeah.
a half hour to get there and want to support them. So I have been looking a lot at different future books. And, last week I went to a used bookstore. So I was looking at some of the future discussions of visual media in a non-visual format because I could see the old covers. And I also, was just today picking up Lord of Chaos, just singular Lord of
Singular,
Chaos,
yes.
which would be the next book for people that don't know. And I was like, oh, maybe I should buy this. And then I was like, we just started. We've got a while before we need that. So the 25 weeks is helpful. I, of course, love when it's like we finish right on the year break or like our,
Right.
being an academic winter break. And so it's a little disappointing we won't do that this year, but I think the fault lies with the big boy, Shadow Rising, not
Yeah.
with Fires of Heaven, which is the book we're talking about today.
Yes, that is correct. Excellent intro. Lots of description about how you spend your days, which is what we all want out of this podcast. I think that we just dive straight in. We had a really interesting chapter, but it's hard to get into what it is without summarizing first because some stuff happened and it was a little subtle. Chapter 2, Rhuidean, or Rhuidean, or Rhuidean, or however we're pronouncing that word. Rand looks out a window over, I have to say it immediately, Rhuidean, thinking of his both of his tattoos on his arms and of his future destiny and how he worries about what is yet to come. He thinks that he must focus on his destiny and how he can achieve the things that are necessary, and then he observes a number of broken skyscrapers across the city. Rand thinks that the city was built for him to find, and then realizes that is, in his words, too proud. He looks down on a courtyard and sees Hadnan Kader leading a group of his workers loading wagons with Terangriel, including the twisted red door that Matt went through in the previous book. A man slips and falls and goes halfway through before Lan pulls him back out. He sees Moraine in the distance, and she seems to convince the panicked workers to continue, even though they seem afraid of both her and the objects. Rand thinks how odd it is that there are hundreds of Aiel in Rhuidean, even though many of them still choose to camp in the mountains rather than enter the city, and he notes that there are 6 clan chiefs who are currently with him. Rand thinks of the number of blood feuds that have been suppressed in order to gather here, and then he asks how he can bring the remaining clans along with him. He starts by asking about the Rain, who apparently are the most inclined to potentially agree with him, and he is told to simply wait and is reminded that many of the Aiel are worried because there are so many now who stare into blankness for days and then eventually abandon the spear. The leaders apparently will eventually come to follow the Kara Karn, but it is noted by the Aiel they did not come come to follow Rand, which means that they will be much more likely to come slowly. Rand thinks about how giving up on the way of the leaf has cut at the idea of what the Aiel are and how they think about honor. And he thinks about how the Aiel were named the dedicated, but eventually gave up the thing they were dedicated to. Important because Giotto is so crucial to the Aiel and their identity that breaking a vow could really kind of cut at who they are. At this point, another clan chief is discussed who apparently has issues with Rand uniting the clans because he had failed to unite the clans earlier. And we learn that many of the clans that have not arrived yet have lost more Aiel to the bleakness, which is what they are referring to the Aiel who give up the spear. We also learn that some of the Aiel who have given up on the kind of traditional culture have not given up on violence, but instead have gone to the Shido. Rand asks whether or not this is something that they can use to spy on Couladin and his Aiel, and this is shut down very quickly with more or less everyone agreeing that it wouldn't be honorable and no one would agree to it. At this point, they ask kind of what is going on across the spine of the world, and we get a little bit of news, mostly that the Civil War continues and that Tyr still seems to be allied with Rand. It is still flying his flag, and we also learn about the area on the other side of the mountains, I'm sorry, on the other side of the waste, which is known as Shara, where we learn apparently slavery is common and basically nothing else is known about it. At this point, Moraine arrives, and as the clan chiefs are filing out, another clan chief, Han, approaches, seemingly upset at Rand that he has hurt his people by sharing the secret of Rhuidean, but he says that he is with him till the end, and then Rand repeats kind of a ceremonial and really bleak kind of tradition with him before he leaves. Rand tells Moraine to send a strong guard with the wagon because he doesn't trust Hadnan Kader. He feels something strike his back after he is rude to Moraine and turns towards both Moraine and Egwene, who are now in the room, and draws on Saidin. He thinks of the madness that is potentially coming for him, and he eventually releases the power because he can't strike back, as he doesn't know whether it was Moraine or Egwene who actually struck him with the blow of the power. Rand thinks it must have been Egwene, but he doesn't have any proof. Rand asks what Moraine wants and calls Moraine little sister, which confuses even himself. Moraine then asks for Natail, who we know is Asmodean, to leave the room, but Rand says that she can say whatever she wants in front of him. Egwene tells him that he is full of himself, and Moraine apparently found a seal of the Dark One's prison and shows it to him. She then takes a small scratch out of it, something which should not be possible, and this is something that is basically a worry to both Rand and Moraine and shows just how weak the seals are. And then Rand begins to think that and then Rand begins to ask Moraine what she intends to do and how she wants to guide him. And Moraine says that eventually she will have to leave him, but doesn't really have any more specifics than that. Moraine then asks Rand about his plans. He defensively says they are his plans, not hers, but she says he has left chaos in his wake everywhere that he's gone. He claims that this is not true because in Tyr, he has actually made the world a better place rather than a worse one. She agrees to that, but says it was actually the wrong decision because he has fallen behind in Tyr, and at any point he could lose all that he has gained, and he hasn't really developed any strength. At this point, Rand actually does reveal what his potential plan is, and this is to gather the Aiel and bring them across the Dragon Wall to end the conflicts in the Westlands and also attempt to unify everyone under a single banner. Moraine says that this is a terrible idea, and she says that the world will unite against him and will undo the work that she and Suan are doing, as she believes that Suan by now has gathered all of the leaders of the world. At this point, Rand does mention another oddity, something called Canbriat, which causes Jason Natail to miss a note as he is playing a song for them. Rand then refers to Moraine and Suan as fools and says that the Terrans never stop scheming against him, and he says that he can't rely on the leaders of the world to follow him. He must basically demand that they follow him by force with the Aiel. She tells him, or at this point, Moraine leaves, telling him to be careful, and while Rand thinks that her formality was designed to mock him, Egwene immediately jumps in and seems to think that Rand is the one who is being stuck up and full of himself, and says that Rand got what he deserves, but then eventually reveals that it was Moraine who struck him with the power, not Egwene. At this point, he starts to hear Egwene kind of go on and on about how frustrating he is, and in his mind, he thinks about Ilyena's temper, a person who he has never met, but somehow remembers exactly what she looks like, and he realized that this must be the beginning of madness. Egwene notices that something is going on in his head and asks if he needs Moraine, but Rand kind of very vehemently says no. Rand lies, saying that at this point, Egwene asks him about Kay and Brat. That's when he lies, saying that it was just something he heard once. And then Rand sees a glass of wine float towards him and grabs it before Egwene can see it hovering in the air. Egwene tells Rand that Elaine loves him, and then she leaves as he angrily turns towards Jason Natale, and we'll pick up on that next week. Uh, a lot of things happened there, most of them in Rand's head, especially the most interesting things happened in Rand's head. Other than Rand's losing it a little, what was your takeaway in this chapter, and what was your kind of overall impression?
I enjoyed this chapter a lot, and I think I thought it did a really good job of doing what we talked about last week, which is catching us up on plot lines where we need reminders while making it still really interesting, right?
Yeah,
And in this case, it's mostly Rand saying like, "Well, I need to remember blah 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 blah," and then doing something, and then saying, "Well, but that reminds me of this," and so on. And there are pieces of that that are just helpful in general because it's been for us a couple weeks, but for some people it would be a longer gap.
yeah,
But it also there were times when I was like, "Oh, it's really nice to have like what happened at the stone towers like summarized in 3 sentences." Because I'm like,
yeah,
perfect. I can remember those 3 sentences versus all the names and all the steps that happened. So the two big things circled in my notes, and we don't have to get in specifics at this moment, but I will say the first is just I thought the dramatic irony of this chapter was delicious. And since I'm a writing instructor, I have to just define dramatic irony. That is, of course, when the audience knows something that the characters do not, right? And
yep,
so the characters being like, let's get this all to Tarvalon, like let's get everything powerful in a
yep,
wagon and make sure it gets to Tarvalon was just really wonderful. And like that perfect kind of like, oh my God, this is like a bomb, right? It's like
yeah,
a bomb you're setting. You're grabbing all these most terrible, wonderful, magical, powerful objects and sending them unknowingly into the hands of, if not the enemy, at least somebody who's not your friend.
yeah,
And that's troublesome. And then the second thing in my notes is I was playing a lot of how crazy is Rand.
yeah,
And I thought that as well kind of falls into that dramatic irony category because while he does mention and think about his madness, there are additional ways in which I thought it was being hinted at to the audience.
yeah,
I spent a lot of the chapter kind of like nobody hit him. He just thinks somebody hit him with some power and like is slowly going mad. And then there were also some more subtle times I thought where he would be speaking to somebody. I think this happened with the council in particular. He was speaking to them and then he was thinking in his head and then speaking words in response to his thoughts,
yeah.
not to what had happened in the room. And I mean, it was like, well, if I'm sitting in that room, I think he's going mad. Like, I think he's really slipping, even though in his head with the narration, we can kind of follow the strands and it makes better sense.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right thing to be paying attention to here. Normally, Robert Jordan plays, as you're describing, the dramatic irony game where our characters don't know things that we do. Sometimes it's really fun when he does the first person thing of thinking we now know things that none of the other characters do, and keeping track of that can be really equally valuable. I actually want to start our discussion just with an image at the beginning of the chapter that we have gotten on the television show a few times, but I thought we finally got our best kind of clear description that when we are thinking of some of these ancient cities, we are talking about skyscrapers. And I think that,
Mm.
describing these like very thin, 10, 20-story buildings that are jagged and broken at the top that clearly were supposed to go higher and have glass all on the outside really emphasizes that we're talking about like a New York style city skyline here. And that I thought was really interesting as a starting place for, as you say, a chapter where a lot of things are kind of unreliable from Rand's perspective. This reminds us that even the world we're in is kind of broken and jagged and doesn't always fit together the way we expect it to.
Well, and it's pretty incredible that the television show put that into the first scene, ends
Yeah.
with that kind of image. And here we are 5 books in, finally like seeing I mean, we've seen Rhuidean before, but like really seeing
Yeah.
confirmation of that. I think I've told you this off air before. I once had the pleasure of attending a Red Sox game with Mayor Menino
Okay.
in as a part of his book tour. And one of the things, so people not from Boston, Mayor Menino was our mayor for a really long time. Not the most like adept mayor, but like kind of charming in a this is just like an old school guy who somehow became mayor.
He was a wonderful mascot for the city, and I don't know what he
Yes.
did in terms of policy, but I love him anyway.
Well, and in one of his now I get well, I'm going to teach you this. Maybe I haven't told you this in real life. One of the things he said as a part of this little, between innings, they were like, and now let us really try to sell you this book. And we were there because my wife was a bookseller, so it was like to get her to sell to her, store in her store and so on. And one of the things he talked about is how he always thought skyscrapers with flat roofs were boring. He's like, they're just boring. Nobody wants a flat roof. You don't want to look up and just see a square roof. And so, if you look at the skyline of Boston, you can basically see that every building that went up when he was mayor will have a slanted roof or will have a weird shape at the top, will just not be flat on the top. So, I was thinking a lot about him when they're saying, like, oh, some of these are jagged. I was like, it's Mayor Menino. He did it. He got these ones into Rhuidean that don't have just flat, boring tops. So that's a game I play constantly when driving
Yep.
around the city.
That's fantastic. I had heard the second half of that story, had no idea it happened at Fenway. That's even
Ah,
better. I think that that is all we really need to say about it, but it's a cool image to open a chapter like this. And then we follow it up with a moment that needs to be shown on screen, someone halfway falling through a magical door
mm.
and being barely caught and dragged back. It's one of those things that I don't picture things well, so I'm like, oh, that's kind of fun. But I imagine if you could get the visual of it, it's a really kind of interesting image in a way that I think a lot of people would enjoy.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing they probably would have done in like a Charlie and the Chocolate Factory movie using like a
Yeah.
mirror like 50 years ago, and it would have been amazing. And now they just do it with CGI. Or I was thinking of like there are some Marvel Doctor Strange moments where somebody like half goes through a portal and their feet are dangling like up in the sky behind
Yeah.
them or something like that. And it kind of felt like one of those. But it was very cool. And I, of course, definitely remembered that that was what Matt had been through. Um, but I guess my question about that section is we have this character, say his name,
Adnan Kader.
and he's completely new, or am I supposed to have remembered him?
So he made kind of minor appearances in the last book. So you'll recall in the last book, there was a cart driver and his beautiful wife slash girlfriend and his very ugly female friend and his Gleeman, and Rand assumed that one or more of them were forsaken. It turned out the ugly woman was Lanfear. It turned out that the Gleeman was Jason Natale, aka Asmodian. It turned out that the beautiful woman was also a dark friend who was trying to steal something from Rand, and Lanfear got her busted. And Hadnan Kader was traveling with all of them. So is he a
Mm.
major character? Not even at all. But could you remember his name? Possibly.
Well, and I did like this idea that I mean it was a very cool both when we first encountered Rhuidean and then at the climactic battle of the last book where you're like and just all these incredibly valuable things are sitting in a plaza. The
Yeah.
Indiana Jones in me was going, they belong in a museum. And now it's like Rand is Indiana Jones. He's like, yeah, take them, go put them somewhere safe. I don't care, but they shouldn't be like out there. It's
Yeah.
or not even that. It seemed more like a like knock yourself out. Go take care of them. And I believe he says in this chapter, I have the ones I need. I
Yep.
don't care what the rest of them do. Go knock yourself out trying to do this. And giving Moraine like a little side project also seems to just keep her out of his hair.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's worth noting that Rand going along with this, I think you've summarized perfectly. The Aiel going along with it, my initial response was like, oh, it's weird they're letting her take all of these things. And then I remember all of those objects arrived there at the behest of Aes Sedai asking ancient Aiel to carry them to a place of safety. So giving them back to the Aes Sedai is probably the perfect outcome as far as those people are concerned. So I just want to add that context, even though I don't really have much else to say about the moment. I think you hit the nail on the head. Um, the next moment that really stood out to me is something that I think I found important, and I know in previous books you have struggled with. We talked about in The Shadow Rising how I was really into the Aiel culture, Aiel history piece, and it felt like that was kind of the thing that was maybe not landing quite as well with you that lowered that book in your estimation relative to me thinking it's the greatest thing ever. So here we get kind of a new framing of what began at the end of the last book. This idea that Rand revealing the secret of Rhuidean, that the Aiel used to follow the way of the leaf, has seemingly broken a large number of Aiel. Many of them stare off into the blankness. Many of them give up their weapons or choose to go to the Shido rather than continuing to follow Rand. And Rand gives us kind of this explanation of why, kind of embedded in the idea of honor. And like Guy Shane is an example of them being willing to give up kind of their identity for a year to maintain the honor, but they now have thousands of years of kind of shame to make up for. Did this recontextualization help you with the Aiel stuff, or was it still just kind of going over your head and wasn't quite what you were looking for in the chapter?
Well, and we did just talk to faithful listener Ben on Friday about how he was in the chapter, not the earlier Aiel stuff, but the penultimate Rand chapter where there's just that big dump of Aiel content. And I think when we
Yeah.
recorded that episode, I was like, oh man, this was tough because it is tough when it's like a lot of words.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen and I've demonstrated too frequently to the audience like it really takes a character getting lodged in my mind before I really lock into their words. And this is, I want to
Yeah.
be clear, this is a failure of me, the reader, not Robert Jordan, the writer. He's consistent. He says what the names are. He gives you kind of grounding for them. But it's like they have to hit a certain like decibel level before I'm
Yeah.
like, nope, that's loud enough that I need to remember it. So I think kind of acknowledging that struggle. This is my opening comment where I was like, when they summarize big events in like 3 sentences, it's very helpful. And I
Yeah.
thought that section in particular was what I was referencing because they do take those 2 chapters, which were the hardest I've ever worked for this show, on the history of the IEL, and they kind of summarize your key takeaways, right?
Yeah.
Your bullet points that you need to take into the next into this book. And I liked that a lot. This idea of the breaking, I also really liked. And I've read ideas closer to that in science fiction usually.
Yeah.
There's a great Neil Stevenson book, I think it's Seven Eves, where like a whole bunch of like half the book happens and then you jump forward like 1,000 years and you see how like the tiny choices of characters became like religions. And this is not the only author who does that. It's
Yeah.
the one that came to mind. But it's always fun to kind of think about and imagine. And I want to be sensitive to our listeners who believe I'm not saying that about any world religion. But you can imagine if you took a world religion, any of them, and you suddenly gave concrete, irrefutable proof that it was built on mistakes and misinformation and lies, I think there would be a lot of people just kind of lost, kind of
Yeah.
broken, and staring off into space saying, oh my goodness, like everything I've built my life on is a lie. And so I think that is really interesting for them as a people And I can get into that drama kind of remembering only slight parts of the kind of earlier drama. It
Yeah.
seems to me, and I'll throw it back to you kind of as a question with, it seems to me the thing to take away from this is Rand's big speech got him like halfway there, but
Yep.
he's going to really have to work on the groups that are still not convinced, and then really, really have to work on the ones that are actively working against him. Kaladin,
Houlihan. Yeah, absolutely.
Couladin, and that clan being the ones that will be the biggest thorn in his side.
Yeah, I think that's basically the right read. The only thing that I would add to that is I think you've done a good job of he won over most. There are a few still left to grab, and then the Shido and Couladin are very concerning. I would also add it seems like the bleakness and the effects of it aren't just isolated to those who haven't joined Rand. And so that's not just a problem for gathering the people who haven't come yet. Also, his allies are, bleeding soldiers essentially as more and more of them give up violence. And so I think it's worth noting the Aiel kind of were perceived previously as almost like an unbeatable fighting force. Rand is thinking 12 of them can conquer the entire world, but if more and more of them suffer the bleakness, that strength kind of dries up fairly quickly. So we want to keep an eye on that in addition to who's in his camp and who's not. That kind of leads us into this conversation with the Aiel clan chiefs, which, as you mentioned earlier, the surface of it is basically here's a list of allies, we need to gather them. But Rand kind of alternating between his internal thoughts and what he says to the clan chiefs causes him to jump around quite a bit in terms of what he says. And the reaction of the clan chiefs is really interesting. Some of them seem kind of taken aback by it. Han almost like tries to reassure him that he's going to stand by him, even though he seems concerned. There's a lot of nuance there. I don't have a lot of little moments highlighted though. It's the big takeaway of how kind of divided and challenging the situation is for me. What stood out to you there?
Uh, I think I'm taking your compliment, or I'm taking it as a compliment that I kind of covered that idea
Yeah.
of I'm in my head, I'm out loud. And I think I had a lot of fun parsing that out. So if listeners are listening to this and they didn't read that scene really closely, kind of noticing that, I would look at that. The second piece of that is I would note that the other piece of potential madness is how many kind of, I call these sharp corners in his thinking there are, that he would suddenly make some connection in his mind and very quickly veer from one topic to another, which again, that's not a sign of madness. God, I hope not anyway. But it is something that, like, again, if I'm a clan chief in that room and
Yeah.
I'm lost and I don't understand because my religion was just proven to be fake. That's again a bit of a wide reading. And then the guy I've chosen to hitch my wagon to is acting this erratically. I would be nervous, even though
Yeah.
I don't think we're meant to read those reactions as nervousness, right? Like,
Right.
I don't think there's that kind of tension, even if we assume they might have the right. They would be going back to their tents and being like, honey, you would not believe the day I had.
Yeah, I think that interaction with Han at the end of that scene is a really good kind of measure of where that's at, right? The Aiel don't worry the way that we think of like them being anxious and questioning decisions and wanting to change, but they get kind of like dark and defeatist, right? Han is like, I will support you even as you lead me to my death. And that is a really not reassuring thing to say at the end of a meeting like that. But I think it kind of summarizes how the Aiel are seeing Rand at this point, right? He is dangerous and unstable, and they're not quite sure what he's going to do, but he's their only hope, and he's the guy in charge, and they'll go along with that till the end. And you gotta kind of give it up to that, even if it's a little horrifying that that's their approach to Rand, because we really hoped he was more stable than that one chapter ago.
Man, did I want to make a US politics joke about the way you framed that, but then I am just sad, and so I don't want
Yeah.
to. But sure, maybe there are some parallels. Well, taking it out of that specific context, I will just say, that does start to feel like what dangerous governments and dangerous movements, even if religious movements, what have you, ha across history have have had to
Yeah.
question, right? Like when the leader starts to show that they're unstable, you either have to, take on the leader and overwhelm his power, or you go down with them, right?
Yeah. Absolutely. I have nothing else to say on that conversation. Any last thoughts on the clan chiefs before we dive into the next section?
I think technically I missed my boat on this one. I should have mentioned this early on, but I will just kind of add it here because it can be marginally related. I was struck in this chapter, something I didn't expect. I mean, once I saw the chapter name, I thought we'd be here. But like we didn't end in here. Like clearly they all marched from the other location to here,
Yeah.
and they're now making this their center of power. And the idea of like a city that was masked in shadow and at the center of religious ritual is suddenly a place you can go live. And there are these references early on to the Aiel are moving in, and some are camping where they used to camp, some are in the city itself.
Yeah.
I started to kind of project way forward, and I was like, I can see a narrative where this becomes the center of Rand's power, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you are probably about to talk about how Moraine's kind of pressuring him to go pick up the sword and get back to the real world, quote unquote. But I can see a narrative where it's like you have a giant stronghold, you have a new kind of utopia.
Yeah.
If you can really get the water flowing and you can build these cities up, like this could be kind of the center of what's to come. So I'm not gonna mark that down as a prediction, but I could see that that is a way you could go, right? Like
Yeah.
Rand could spend 5 books in this city accumulating power and influence and then go strike back, but we'll have to see how that goes. And I think that is just underscored by the clan chiefs being here and being a part of his gathering.
Yeah. I can't say a word about that, but good thoughts. I think those are things that we should be keeping an eye on. You said you expected me to talk about Moraine. I actually want to talk about Egwene first, because she is the
Mm.
character who I see changed the most. You mentioned that we have that probably like 4 to 6 week gap that we identified at the beginning of the book. I think that Egwene is a character who is behaving in a lot of ways differently than we had seen before. One, she is dressing like an Aiel as opposed to dressing like someone from the Two Rivers or an Aes Sedai. Second, it's worth noting that she has taken to wearing jewelry, and it's noted that she is still hiding herself as a true Aes Sedai as opposed to simply one of the accepted. And it's worth noting Rand kind of points out about Egwene that she seems confident is the word that I want to use, right? She is now the way I want to describe it is in the previous books, it felt like she was kind of playing at being an Aes Sedai or was like playing the role of an Aes Sedai. And now I feel like you're really seeing Egwene's personality shine through while she is still doing some of that Aes Sedai stuff, right? Rand, I think, refers to her as not being calm enough to be an Aes Sedai, but she is every time that it's not just her and Rand in a room. So I want to give her some credit for changing quite a bit in the past 4 to 6 weeks.
That's helpful to me. I think what comes to mind is, fill in your problematic white savior movie. Is
Yeah.
it Dances with Wolves? Is it Avatar, your favorite?
Oh.
Is it
The Last
but
Samurai.
like The Last Samurai, these movies where it's all about somebody quote unquote going native, right? That
Yeah.
somebody who's getting soaked into a culture to, and usually that really just means basic understanding in
Yeah.
those types of problematic movies, and like respecting the humanity of them. But it does feel like Egwene might have leveled up, and I was struck by how strong her kind of condemnation of Rand took the terms of I should not have told Elaine to
Mhm.
go after you,
Yeah.
essentially. And there is a time where I was so rooting for Egwene and Rand that that would have felt really meaningful.
Mhm.
But as a reader, I'm like, well, that train is gone. Like
Yeah,
it
that ship
left the
sailed.
station. So we're not I'm not rooting for them, and I'm not seeing that as what's happening, but instead this idea that we talked before about how Rand was also positioned with Min, and it's like,
Yeah.
well, if chapter 1 really pushed us to think about Min again, chapter 1, yes, not the
Yeah.
prologue, chapter 1, and then now we're getting this like, well, you're not good enough for Elaine. Where that is all going, I'm not entirely sure, but it seems like we're putting that very much into play for this book here at the introductory stages.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in that context, it's worth noting Min has had multiple discussions of a vision she once had of Rand herself and two other women. So if we're putting Elaine in that list, we've still got one more to go before we really figure out all of the pieces in whatever that vision that Min had was. Um, the
Lanfear. I'm guessing Lanfear. I'm just you. Tyler can't say anything. He's actually crying a little because I interrupted him. But
a viable option.
Lanfear.
Uh, let's now switch gears to Moraine. I think we'll have a little more to say about Egwene at the end of the chapter, but that's more plot than character. Moraine shows up here, and can't tell whether she has regressed from the last book or not, right? In The Shadow Rising, we frequently were referring to Moraine as finally being a bit more open with Rand, right? It seemed like before she had basically been giving him nothing. And in The Shadow Rising, she was kind of giving him advice and information and trying to invite him to kind of confide in her and, share something. And here, he basically says, "No, I'm not going to share." And she says, "Okay, fine." And
Mm.
I can't tell if this is a new tack for her or what has changed exactly.
It is interesting to me how impotent this character feels compared to
Mm,
where I placed her mentally kind of in book 1 and 2, right? She was the
yep.
master. She's playing three-dimensional chess. I think a lot of last book she felt like she was playing catch up with whatever Rand was doing. And here it feels like she might legitimately have the better knowledge and the better plans, but can do nothing to
Yeah.
like break through and push for that. And it strikes me as a conflict I've seen a lot of my fellow teachers face,
Mm,
right? And anything I describe it as is too simplistic. So I'll just go to the simplistic version is like, do you try to be the cool teacher who gets along with them and then gets walked all over? Or
right.
do you try to be the super strict teacher who pushes them so hard that they hate you until like the last week of the semester and then they really love you because they learned so much as a part of that? And I think, in my coming on 17 years of teaching, I've seen every variation of that
Yeah.
combination. And the truth is you have to kind of walk somewhere in the middle. You have to respect their humanity and be understanding, but also be rigid when you
My
need to.
my strategy was to tell them I was going to be horrible and rigid and then never actually enforcing those policies.
I've been there. I've been on that path. So it does feel like if I'm looking at Moraine as a mentor figure in the classic kind of Gandalf, Obi-Wan Kenobi type mold, that they're in a moment of struggle and that she is there's usually a moment when the heroic figure is trying to push aside the mentor.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's because they've learned all they can and they are really prepared. And sometimes it's because they need to be humbled, right?
Yeah.
And they need to say, I'm bigger and badder than you. I mean, what do we both teach 18-year-olds, right? There's always that moment where somebody's like, actually, I'm way smarter than you. And then there's often the comeuppance of, okay, like
Yeah.
I need more help than I let on. That's just natural. That's what teenagers, and these are teenagers, are like. And so the fact that Maureen is in this moment where she seems so impotent, I think I'm leaning at the moment towards Rand is too far over his skis and he will need to kind of. I think the Egwene language makes us think he's kind of too big headed, the
Yep.
idea that this is all his destiny. So it feels to me like he's pushing a little too hard and he's going to kind of come back in this book and start listening to these two women again.
Yeah.
And I particularly say two women because we do have the gendered power. So it
Yeah.
kind of fits into this idea. You get too far into the kind of the testosterone side of the power, and you need to
Yeah.
kind of come back a little and find that balance. Feels to me a little bit of what this tension is about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I'll note Rand is already kind of acknowledging that, right? Early in the chapter, he has that moment where he thinks the entire city was built just for him to find it, and then realizes just how kind of self and egocentric that is. And so the fact that Rand is kind of grappling with this on his own, and then I think you're exactly right. Both Egwene and Moraine are trying to point out how that kind of attitude is harming him and could hold him back. I think that's definitely something we should be keeping an eye on in this book is how is he kind of interacting with that struggle. Um, there's a seal of the Dark One's prison here, and for once, it's not broken. I'm pretty sure we now are aware of where 5 of the seals are or were, but 3 of them have been shattered.
Five of
The Seals of the Dark One's prison.
No, five out of how many?
7. Yes, sorry.
So 5 of 7, 3 are shattered. And I like the conceit that there's something just generally weakening these, right? The
Yeah.
idea that this one can chip is frightening, right? And it shows I thought the mythology piece was done really nicely, where Rand is simultaneously telling us this one just broke off on the table, and also this is unbreakable, like what's happening here.
Yeah.
And the fact that it is beyond Moraine and Rand just sets up again some nice tension and suspense for what's coming, I think, in this book or across the next few books.
Yeah, absolutely. I then want to bring our attention to something specific that Moraine said that I probably read 8 times, trying to parse out if there was more that I could say about it and what I would say and what have you. Rand basically asks whether Moraine intends to go to Tarvalon with the artifacts. And she responds, eventually, I will have to leave you. What will be must be. You must be ready. And then she changes the subject. And that is a weird, vague non answer from a character who we know cannot lie. And so when she says something like, eventually I will have to leave you, that makes me wonder, she has now seen or gotten answers about her future multiple times, right? She's talked to Min about her visions. She's gone through the door at the base of the Stone of Tyr and gotten 3 answers from the Aelfin. And she has gone through the test that the wise ones go through, where they see visions of their future over and over and know what could be. And so when she gives an answer that is as specific as, eventually I will have to leave you, I'm immediately wondering, what does she know and when does she want to leave, and all of these questions that I wouldn't ask if anyone else said that.
That's very helpful. I don't think I necessarily remembered that. So to remember that she is speaking at that level. I already invoked Gandalf,
Yeah.
Obi-Wan Kenobi, throw in Dumbledore. That sounds like the mentor figure, right? Saying like, my role is limited. I'm not the one who gets to see this fight through till the end.
Yeah.
And whereas, she's not talking about death here, it does sound like it's kind of a permanent separation, right? Like,
Yeah.
and she knows where she'll be at the end. That is interesting in the context of Tarvalon, because in my mental checklist of future prophecies, I've kind of always said Egwene is ascending to be the Amerlin seat. So I would say Egwene needs to get back to Tarvalon. I don't know that I have mentally checked a box that says, well, Moraine has to get back there. Although
Yeah.
she also says, I will eventually leave you. She doesn't say, I have to return to Tarvalon.
So she responds to the question, you intend to go yourself, as in intend to go to Tarvalon yourself, with the answer eventually. So
Okay.
that makes me suspect the answer is eventually she will go to Tarvalon, but I suppose there's enough wiggle room that maybe it's eventually I will follow the wagons, or eventually I will go to something related.
Take the road to the west. Yeah.
Right.
Something vague like that. And I am on record as saying I thought Moraine got a little lost last book. We also lost Lan, although he gets a shout out in this chapter. I'm like, he is still there. He's around. So save the guy from the door. I don't think that was in your summer. You just said the guy got pulled out, but it was Lan.
Yeah.
So I am still I'm hopeful for a little more Moraine after this chapter, but I am suspicious about Lan. I think Lan might sit out another book. So I'm nervous because I do really like that. We did, of course, as we talked about, have a lot of hints about up where he's from, that there's something going on there. So maybe there's still hope. And this is only our first chapter with this group of characters. And not that I'm transitioning out of it, but I suspect next week is also with these characters.
That is very likely correct. I have a couple more things I want to talk about here. First off, if we're thinking about Rand and madness, or Rand and kind of losing his grip, as you described, kind of the hard turns in his mind, it is a little bit reassuring that he is still taking the position, I did the right thing in Tyr by trying to set things right, even as Moraine is kind of not quite against character, but certainly kind of not what we would expect from the hero, pushing Rand to think in a very cold, calculating, how can I gain power and how can I use it kind of way. That's an interesting tension for those characters to be in, because since Rand is so focused on his destiny, that's what he's being criticized for. The fact that he still is very much happy with how he handled the one place that he didn't act solely in fulfillment of his destiny, I think is kind of an interesting kind of starting block for this character. He knows what he has to do, but he's still proud of the times when he kind of deferred doing it.
Well, and I read them as the two theories of power, right? That
Yeah.
Moraine is essentially arguing, go show how strong you are, people will follow. And he was looking for something what I would call more democratic, lowercase d, which is let me go get the people to stop fighting each other and unite them kind of by putting out the fires slowly. And I think the history of the world is like split between those, right?
Yeah.
If power has to be exerted from the top down or the bottom up. And so I think we're going to see some, debate between these characters about the right way to do that. And I assume with whatever outcome arrives, we might get a hint of kind of what Robert Jordan believes. But I think I guess where I personally am at the moment is either of those can be effective, right? Like
Yeah.
you can go slowly put out these fires and these civil wars and gather people up. It's going to take a long time. Whereas, yes, going and picking up the sword and saying, I'm the only hope for the world, follow me, can work as well. So I don't it's a good argument because both could be right and they
Yeah.
have every right to believe what they're arguing, but we'll have to see where the events play out.
Absolutely. I think the only kind of interesting twist on that is if what you're saying is Rand is taking an effective but slow kind of strategy and Moraine is advising speed, even if it is not quite as elegant. That makes me wonder what Moraine knows about whether or not there is a need for speed, because
Mm.
that's a little bit worrisome as if Rand is taking the slow route and it needs to happen very quickly. I think what we've got.
Well,
Oh,
and
go ahead.
and just note that it's a chapter where we're reminded of the ticking clock,
Yeah.
essentially, right? That we have these five seals, three of which we know are smashed, but it's like there is a clock ticking here, and so maybe we should be leaning more towards Moraine. But go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think the last thing we cover in this chapter then is the hints at Rand's madness. He refers to Moraine as little sister. He refers to being buried in Canbriat. And he refers in his head to thinking of a woman named Ilyena and her temper, and he can picture her even though he knows he has never met her. I would love to get your thoughts on Rand's madness, and I would like you to take enough time for me to go and grab the first book so I can double check whether I can tell you something or whether it hasn't been mentioned yet.
So I would say where my mind went on this one, and it is a bit of a roundabout, so I'm going to buy Tyler the time he desires, which is I started thinking a lot about Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse Five and how Billy Pilgrim becomes unstuck in time. Tyler is just now putting back on his headphones and has no idea what I said.
Slaughterhouse
Uh,
Five, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. And the idea of that character is when you're unstuck in time, he starts to kind of have to think fourth dimensionally. Now I'm doing Back to the Future, right? You're
Yeah.
just not thinking fourth dimensionally, Marty. And so I think this to me is Rand is starting to think fourth dimensionally, which is as he ascends, he is going to be aware of all his past selves in the same way that the Forsaken are aware of all their past selves. And it seems completely reasonable to think that that's somebody going mad or that you would
I,
go mad feeling.
I like every piece of that, but I want to be really careful about one little bit of it. I
Yeah.
don't know that it is necessarily true that the Forsaken remember their past selves. I think they just haven't died since their past
Mm.
self, right? They are just
Okay.
3,000 years old. And so they remember the last time they were around because it was literally them. Everything else about that, though, absolutely spot on. Love the analysis.
So you feel like if you are well, and now I'm going to reference another Indiana Jones movie, the one nobody talks about at that Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. The villain in that movie, she gets in front of the interdimensional beings and she gets to say the one thing she wants, and she wants all the knowledge, and so she dies with her mind kind of burning up because of that. And that was such a roundabout way to say that's how I think of Rand. That
Yeah.
Rand is receiving exactly what he wants. He's getting the knowledge of all of Lews Therin, and
Yep.
with the caveat that Lews Therin might be working differently than the Forsaken. Um, that if he is going to ascend, he has to, in my mind, learn to manage this. That this
Yep.
is going to happen, and it could overwhelm him and lead to madness, or it could be a source of great power and knowledge for what's to come.
Let me add quite a bit of support to that theory. I'm quite impressed by the leap that you made. Uh, do you know where the
Because I mentioned Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. That is
obviously?
why you were impressed.
Uh, I assume, knowing you and the way that you think about names, that you did not recognize the name Ilyena.
No.
That's a good thing, because otherwise it means that you somehow remembered a random name from the first prologue of The Eye
Ooh.
of the World, the first book in the series. When we
Wow.
begin in Lews Therin's point of view, he cries to his wife Ilyena.
Okay. And that is something we've now seen a little of in the
Yes.
show. Yes, 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 yes. Cool. I'm excited. I mean, I think if I have a wish for this book, it's that Rand has been moving too slowly, and I really want a kind of big leap forward. If we're gonna keep spending this much time in his head, I'd like him to be doing something notably different this book, other than I'm slowly moving towards my destiny. Given that we are on book 5 of 14, that's probably a wish that won't come true. But Tyler can't comment on that. So Tyler, what do you want to comment on instead?
Uh, I want to comment on the fact that we are now 25 weeks away from finishing this book, which I know is a really long countdown, but it's so much shorter than the previous book. I feel like we're already well along the way. Uh, I think what's really exciting here is that, as you're describing, the beginning of this book feels a little different than a lot of the other books, right? We got two big non-main character chapters early on to kind of set up the world. We're now seeing, as you say, Rand in a very different way. Even if he's not doing things differently externally, he is much more interesting to read internally. And we're getting to see a lot of our kind of previous side characters evolving and shifting in interesting ways. So I'm really excited for you to see where this goes and for us to get there quickly, at least compared to The Shadow Rising. I can't promise super quick. It's a Robert Jordan book. It's like 800 pages long. We do have 2 chapters next week. And as Greg implied, we are going to, at least in the first one, stick with the current plot line. So these chapters are going to be Chapter 3, Pale Shadows, and Chapter 4, Twilight, which are titles that go together, and makes me ask you, what do you think links them if they have the same chapter title type?
I think whatever happens in the first will cause ramifications in the second. I don't know. I'd feel more confident if it was the other order. If
Yeah.
Because I feel like Twilight causes Pale Shadows, but Pale Shadows stretching out towards Twilight, will stick with that. So if you are listening as this drops, and I just counted on my fingers correctly, you should this Friday have the final of our television show episodes. So if you have been waiting, now's the time to binge. And those 4 episodes, each covering 2 television episodes from season 2 of the Wheel of Time TV show. That's our fun August activity. As I record this, we are still waiting to hear about the future, which I think I've said every week for the past 3 weeks. The future is coming. We just don't know when it will be here. But that not only is a fun activity, but I will say I have been using it as I've guest starred on other podcasts and to plug, like, hey, if you want to see what I do over here, but you don't want to read, you could check out these episodes. So
Totally.
if you enjoy those television episodes or you enjoy our podcast in general, we would love it if you would share and just kind of help people find us. We are totally available wherever you find us, and that includes YouTube now. So if you have that person in your life who just puts on YouTube endlessly and might like to talk through Wheel of Time, you could plug the book club format, or you could tell them you could just listen because we summarize the chapters if they've read them before
Yeah.
or want to do the audiobook or some such. So we are always shocked and amazed how many of you listen to us. We joke about the two people we know, but we hear from a lot of you from time to time, and we see the follower counts and the download numbers, and it's always quite overwhelming, and we are grateful for it. But we want to keep growing our community by doing nothing, by having you all grow it for us. But we'll do
There it
our
is.
best. And then maybe we'll see you and maybe a few of your friends through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.